Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining today's session for applicants on PCCD's 2023-2024 School Safety and Security Competitive Grants Program. My name is Sam Cook and I serve as the Director of Policy and Planning within our Executive Director's office here at PCCD. I am joined by a couple of my PCCD colleagues who are helping to co-present and facilitate today's session. Ali Gantz, our Director of Communications, and Kirsten Kenyon. Kirsten, you want to say hello to the group?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Kirsten Kenyon, and I'm the Director of the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development here at PCCD. My office has the distinct fortune of overseeing the School Safety Unit.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. All right, so a couple of quick housekeeping rules before we get started. First, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be posting a link to that recording on our website and on our YouTube channel as soon as it's available. We'll also post a copy of the PowerPoint slides for you to view and reference as well. We would encourage you to take a brief moment just to double check your audio settings, make sure you're able to hear today's presentation. Please note that on this Teams live platform, we unfortunately cannot hear you. However, please rest assured we did carefully review the questions that were submitted by you all as you registered for today's session. So we hope that the content that we present is aligned with the questions and things you're curious about as a group. So moving towards today's agenda, we'll be kicking things off with a brief overview of our agency, and then we'll dive into a quick recap of the school safety competitive funding announcement and application process. We'll then spend the remainder of our presentation on some frequently asked questions, those ones that you all submitted as part of the registration process that I mentioned a moment ago, as well as some other questions we've been fielding from folks since the funding announcement opened last month. So just a friendly reminder, and we'll mention this a couple of times during the presentation, that you can view a list of questions and answers to this funding announcement on our active funding announcement webpage. So definitely encourage you to check out that resource if you haven't already. So with all of those instructions and caveats behind us, let's go ahead and dive in. So first, just a little bit about our agency. So the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we are more commonly known, was established in 1978 through Pennsylvania state law. We serve as the Commonwealth's justice planning and policymaking agency and do a lot of really important work around public safety issues for the Commonwealth. Our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems, facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime, and to increase the safety of our communities. We're a relatively small but growing state agency housed within the executive office. We have about 150 employees. We work across 4 offices, and we have an overarching commission, which is advised by 7 different advisory committees and 2 training boards. Important for this group, we do have a school safety and security committee. So that's the committee that is responsible for spearheading our school safety and security grant program, of which this competitive grant program is a part of, among some other school safety related initiatives and efforts that they're responsible for. So our agency's programs and responsibilities touch on a pretty wide range of areas. Obviously, funding and grants is a big one, but we do a lot more than that. Everything from training and technical assistance to data and research, victims compensation and services, and lots more. So if you're interested in learning more about those areas, would definitely encourage you to check out our website, which is pccd.pa.gov. So now I'm going to turn things over to Kirsten, who's going to be providing an overview of the funding announcement. Kirsten?
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so now I'm giving a high-level overview of the funding announcement, our competitive grant program. Before we dive into the specifics of this particular funding announcement, we just want to make sure that everyone is aware of the fact that the School Safety and Security Competitive Grant Program is just one of several school safety and security related solicitations that were recently announced by our agency just last month. These include the school district meritorious grants, which are a non-competitive solicitation that's available only to school districts. We have the school mental health grants, which again is another non-competitive formula-based funding announcement that school districts, charters, intermediate units, and area and career and technical centers can request funding from. We have this funding announcement, which is the competitive school safety grants solicitation, which I'll get into a little bit more detail later. And then we also have the targeted school safety grants for non-public schools, which is another competitive funding announcement open to non-public schools, with intermediate units eventually going to be making formal application on their behalf to our agency. If you haven't done so already, we strongly encourage you to visit PCCD's school safety webpage to learn more information about each of these solicitations. You can also view or download applicant-specific one-pagers that outline eligibility criteria and basic information about each of these funding opportunities. So let's get on to it. Today's focus, the fiscal year 23-24 School Safety Competitive Grants Program. As we just covered, this funding announcement is part of a broader package of school safety and security program grant funding opportunities announced by our agency in January of this year. The primary purpose of the competitive grant program is to address physical security enhancements and behavioral health needs for school entities, and for those municipalities and law enforcement agencies and approved vendors coming in for it, school security personnel needs. Folks may recall that the last time PCCD opened or awarded our school safety competitive grant program was back in fiscal year 2019-2020. So it's been a couple of years since we've opened this competitive solicitation up, and it's been a couple of years since it's been an option for school entities to utilize. So also new to this year, the competitive solicitation blends funding opportunities from our PCCD's traditional school safety and security grant program and the Department of Education's targeted school safety grant program. And what we've done here is create a single competitive application for school safety funding. Act 33 of 2023 shifted the Department of Education's competitive school safety grants program to PCCD and the School Safety and Security Committee for administration. And rather than create multiple competitive funding opportunities for public school entities and related law enforcement partners, this single solicitation blends them all together. Eligible applicants under this competitive solicitation include school entities as defined under Section 1301-B. So that means a school district, intermediate unit, career and technical center, charter schools, approved private schools, chartered schools for the education of the deaf or the blind, or private residential rehabilitative institutions are eligible to apply, as well as municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors applying to provide school security personnel services within schools. Sam, I think we're experiencing technical difficulties.
So sorry about that. Let me get it squared away.
It's okay.
There you go. Apologies.
Thank you. That's okay. Just for this fiscal year, a total of approximately $32.2 million in state funds is available for this solicitation. So now that we have a high-level picture of the funding opportunity, let's get into some details of this funding announcement. As noted previously, a total of $32 million in state funds is available for this competitive fiscal year 23-24 school safety competitive grant solicitation. Per the law, school entities are capped at a maximum award of $450,000 for an up to 2-year project, except for the School District of Philadelphia, who can request up to $1.8 million or 7% of the money available in the fund, and the Pittsburgh School District, which is up to $790,000 or 3% of the fund. Both of these exceptions for these two school entities are included in the law. Municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors will be limited to a maximum award of $150,000 for an up to 2-year project period to support school security personnel services within either a public school entity or a non-public school. As I mentioned earlier, eligible applicants are spelled out under Section 1301-B, and I won't read them again because you can see them on the screen. And we also allow for municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors to apply to provide school security personnel services. Now, approved vendors are those that were previously recognized by the Department of Education to provide school police officer services, and also those recognized by PCCD to provide school security guard services. A caveat or a note, if you're not sure that you're an eligible entity, you can always look up your school's designation using the PA Department of Education's EDNA system, or you can check out our Q&A on our website, or a questions and answers document on our website. Chances are we've probably already provided some direction on eligibility. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam to cover eligible programs and activities and some additional considerations.
Thanks, Kirsten. So in terms of eligible programs and activities, just a note that municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors are limited to expending funding on school security personnel only. So school entities, if that's your category, can use your competitive grant funds to support any of the allowable programs and activities identified in school code under that subsection that we're always rattling off, which is 1306B subsection J, numbers 1 through 30. And those are activities that are designed to enhance physical school security needs as well as improve mental health supports. So those include, but are not limited to, some of the areas that are shown on this slide. And that includes school security personnel, school counselors, and mental health personnel and services, either employed or contracted. Security planning and purchase of technology, which if you've been through this process a couple of times, you might know that that's activity number 12. That used to come with a requirement for a board letter for those items, but thanks to Act 33, that is no longer going to be a requirement for this year's school safety grants program. So you can see a lot of other really important areas too, everything from violence prevention, trauma-informed approaches, student and staff training programs, threat assessment, and a whole host of other kind of activities you can use these funds for. One new area that we wanted to highlight, so this year the School Safety and Security Committee did endorse the inclusion of violence prevention programs, including community violence reduction activities, which are under activity number 22 of that list in school code. So that's a new one, and we would certainly encourage folks to check that out if it's of interest. In addition to checking that one out, make sure to take a look at the whole listing. You can find an easy to reference document that outlines all of those areas on our school safety webpage. So now that we've covered what you can use competitive grant funds for, let's talk a little about what you can't. So the competitive funding announcement does identify a number of ineligible program activities and expenses that applicants should be mindful of when you're developing your proposal. And those include any item that's not specifically identified in section 1306B, subsection J, numbers 1 through 30 of the school code. If it's not listed there, it may be deemed ineligible. In addition, expenses and activities that are explicitly referenced on page 8 of the written funding announcement, those are activities that have been deemed ineligible by the School Safety and Security Committee, so make sure you check those out as well. So now that we've talked a little bit about things that funding can support, things it can't support, let's chat a little bit about some priority considerations that our agency will be factoring in for our review of applications that are submitted under this competitive solicitation. So first things first, priority consideration will be given for requests that address any gaps identified in physical security assessments or behavioral health assessments that are conducted for a school entity that meets the standards and criteria established by the School Safety and Security Committee. So if you haven't looked at those recently, you can view and download those standards and assessment criteria by visiting the aptly named assessment criteria section of our School Safety and Security website. So the second priority consideration will be for funding requests that help school entities meet level 1 of the baseline criteria standards for physical security and or behavioral health that were recently revised and adopted by our School Safety and Security Committee back in May of 2023. So we'll get a little bit more into baseline criteria in just a minute or two. It's worth noting, and you can see it kind of highlighted on this slide as well, that PCCD does consider proposals for using funds to complete a physical security or a behavioral health assessment to be a level 1 baseline criteria activity. So if your school entity hasn't completed one of those in the past, that might be something you could consider with this funding opportunity among other eligible activities. So finally, as we usually do, PCCD will be taking into account geographic distribution when making funding recommendations. So if you check out Appendix A of the written funding announcement, you can see geographic distribution of awards is required by law, and our School Safety and Security Committee has adopted a 12-region model of Pennsylvania. We adopted that back in 2019-20, and that assists in determining the number or types of awards, rather, number of awards for competitive school safety grants. Regions are organized based on population, contiguous intermediate units, and the total number of possible grant requests from that area. And then funding allocated to each region will be determined based on the average of both the total percentage of the population of that region and the total percentage of the funding of requests of the applicants for that region. It's a mouthful. So this helps us and our team hopefully ensure a more equitable distribution of funding throughout the state. So we talked a little about baseline standards, and you might be asking yourself, well, what the heck are baseline standards? So our baseline criteria standards were originally adopted back in 2021 by the School Safety and Security Committee, and they were really born out of a desire to help inform school entities' decisions about both physical security as well as behavioral health and mental health needs. And so those standards were developed and, as I mentioned, recently revised based on input from a multidisciplinary work group with diverse representatives from the field of education, field of public safety. And the baseline criteria standards have criteria that's organized across multiple levels, with the most basic and foundational elements identified as level 1, and then more advanced criteria following at levels 2 and 3. And so as we covered earlier, although it's not required, we are strongly encouraging all applicants to take a look at those standards, review them, and use some of the tools and resources that we've developed, including a self-assessment checklist and resource guides to familiarize yourself with those standards. We think they're really helpful as strategic planning tools. It's a really great way to kind of think about what your school entity or community might need. You can also check out a recent webinar session that we hosted that focuses entirely on those revised baseline criteria standards if you're curious to learn more. So just want to reiterate again, for purposes of this competitive funding announcement, that you are not limited to only applying for level 1 baseline criteria items or activities. You're eligible to apply for anything under this funding announcement that's allowed under section 1306B subsection J. So just bear in mind that while not required, we're just going to be prioritizing level 1 requests and those that satisfy assessment recommendations. So I know that was a question that a number of folks had as they were registering for the webinar, so hopefully that's helpful clarification. So in addition to carefully reviewing the written funding announcement document on allowable and unallowable uses of funds, we also encourage applicants to keep in mind some other financial considerations associated with this non-competitive funding announcement. So first, we encourage you to carefully review the competitive bidding and sole source procurement section of the written funding announcement. That has important procurement related information and requirements that you should keep in mind as you build your proposal. Please note that PCCD does have approval of all final budgets. And in addition, grant funds need to be used to supplement and not supplant or replace existing spending on school safety and school mental health initiatives and programs that may already be in place. So speaking of supplantation, this is an area that our agency often receives questions about from applicants. And it was certainly a popular topic that came up in questions that were submitted by webinar participants today. So what is supplantation? I think a helpful way to think about it is to first talk about what supplantation isn't. So you can see on the left that we generally would not consider the following to be supplantation. That would include requesting funds for the same purpose as a prior PCCD school safety grant, requesting items or personnel that are currently funded, but might not be included or recurring in the school entity's budget. So for example, if you have staff or items that were paid for using other grant funds or other sources of funding that's going away, for example. You can also request additional funding to increase the hours for current personnel. So we wouldn't consider it to be supplementation if, for example, you're using grant funds to pay for somebody to go from part-time to full-time, or if you were increasing the number of hours available for somebody that you're paying for, or to just generally increase program activity or capacity. So now that we've covered what it isn't, here are a couple of things that we generally would consider to fall under the category of supplementation. So that would include requesting grant money for activities, people or personnel items that are currently included in your annual budget, as well as using funds to retroactively support expenses that you've already purchased or procured. So as an example, we would consider supplementation generally to be like using grant funds to pay ongoing expenses as part of a previously executed contract or purchase order. So we know that this is a complicated topic sometimes and that you all do juggle a lot of different funding sources. So if you have any questions about whether something is or isn't supplementation, with the caveat that this is a competitive application, so we may not be able to answer a ton of specifics, we do encourage you to reach out if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about those expectations. So a couple of other things in addition to those financial considerations that you all should keep in mind for this funding announcement. So the first is that Act 33 did amend the Pennsylvania Public School Code to create some new requirements related to an existing piece of statute related to annual school safety incident data reporting to PDE and establishing memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement. So under those amendments, any school entity or other agency that fails to comply with those provisions may not be awarded grant funding that's administered by PCCD's School Safety and Security Committee. So that would include school safety grants like the competitive grants that we're talking about today. And that would be in place until that entity has come into compliance. And in addition, just a note that current law has a provision in it that states that if a law enforcement agency fails to report their Uniform Crime Report data or UCR data to the Pennsylvania State Police, they are ineligible to receive any grant funding by PCCD until they come into compliance with that UCR data reporting. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Last bit of considerations to chew on. So we mentioned earlier, but bears repeating, that thanks to changes that were made by Act 33, board letters are no longer required to justify Activity 12 expenses. So those are security planning and purchase of security-related technology. So hopefully that makes things a little easier for you all. We know that was a little bit of a lift last year. And finally, as with prior school safety grants that are administered by our agency, we wanted to make school entities aware that under Pennsylvania state law, any sensitive information that's included within your applications for funding will not be accessible for inspection or duplication under Pennsylvania's right to know law. So the law considers sensitive information to be defined as anything that's reasonably likely to result in a substantial or demonstrable risk of physical harm or personal security of staff or students. So with all those being said, I'm going to turn things back to Kirsten to guide us through the application process.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so all applicants must submit their competitive application using PCCD's eGrant system in order to receive funding. Applications must be submitted electronically in our system by 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, February 29th, 2024. The eGrants application starts with an executive summary, which includes a very short script asking you to supply how much you're applying for and what you'll be expending the funds on. We just ask that you please follow the script Doesn't need to be super long or in depth because we do use them to help inform the committee as to what you made application for. There's also a section for program activities, which is that full listing of the 30 eligible program activities allowed under section 1306-BJ that we constantly reference. For school entities, we're just asking you to select the categories that best correspond with what you're seeking funding for. For municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors, you probably just need to select activity 18, which is the activity that corresponds best with school security personnel. In our applicant overview section, which is worth 20 points in total, we're asking for basically a short description about yourself, including a location of your school, the total number of student occupied buildings, and total student enrollment figures of your school entity or the school that you intend to serve. We also ask for a description about your experience and efforts related to improving school safety, including any current or recent initiatives or activities. We also ask for a brief description of your overall financial situation. Now, moving to the project description section of the application, we'll note that there are 3 subsections that address individual project areas applicants are interested in pursuing. For our school entities on the call, there's 2 subsections that pertain to you. That's the physical security enhancement section and a behavioral health needs subsection. For municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and approved vendors, there is a specific subsection for you pertaining to school security personnel. I would note, because someone did notice it, the 60-point total of this subsection, of this entire project description section is for the entire section. It's applicable to all the narrative you supply in your project description, regardless of which section you fill out. Again, we just want to note you only need to respond to questions in the subsections that align with your proposal. I also want to draw attention to an issue that we discovered recently, shortly just right after releasing the application. We did set up each subsection with skip logic so that if you were not applying for funding under a given section, you could just respond, no, I'm not applying for funding under this section. And ideally, it would have allowed you to skip having to answer any other questions in that subsection and just allowed you to save the section and moved on. Unfortunately, we found that our skip logic has a bit of a glitch in it, and it still requires you to answer a few questions within the subsection before you can complete the section. Unfortunately, we have no way of updating our funding announcement in the eGrant system to fix this matter at this time without possibly jeopardizing the entire solicitation. So when prompted, just go ahead and answer any additional questions that the subsection prompts you to complete. Just know that on our end, if you mark a project description subsection as a no, I'm not coming in for funding under here, please, you don't need to fill out any of the other questions in that section except for the ones that you're unfortunately forced to answer. We'll inform our reviewers of that glitch, and it should not negatively impact your score in any way. Continuing on with my overview of the project description sections, within the physical security and behavioral health subsections, school entities will be asked about baseline level 1 criteria and whether or not they meet those requirements. If they don't, they'll be asked how they intend to meet those requirements or if they're using funding from this solicitation to help meet that requirement. Applicants will also be asked if the request being made was noted as a deficiency within a professionally completed assessment, that is, an assessment conducted by an individual on the School Safety and Security Committee's registry. As Sam mentioned earlier, school entities are not limited to only coming in for level 1 or basic items or activities. You can come in for any eligible project activity, but the baseline criteria and assessment questions are just being used to help us prioritize the requests being made. School entities will also be asked to provide a justification for the request, which should include describing the problem that the project will address and articulate why the requested items are needed and how the need was identified. Supporting data and facts should be provided and be specific to the project and relevant to the problem and your proposed request. Conversely, municipalities, law enforcement, and approved vendors seeking funding to support school security personnel, they'll be asked questions about whether or not the personnel are going to meet the training and qualifications required under Article 13-C of the Public School Code. If applying for a school police officer, there's some additional requirements in law that we're supposed to ask questions about, so you'll be asked to answer those questions. You'll also be asked if the personnel you're requesting helps the school you'll be working with to meet their level 1 baseline criteria standards or satisfy a gap recognized in a professional assessment for their school. Again, eligible applicants under this section will be asked to provide narrative on their project request and provide justification for the request, including providing information on past funding used to support school security personnel. And finally, the budget details section will ask you to provide line item information such as personnel, benefits, consultants, training and travel, equipment and supplies, construction, and any other category about your request. And this section accounts for about 20 points. As ever, applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully read and review the written funding announcement document prior to starting on their application in PCCD's eGrants system. eGrants has a timeout feature on it, so that means if you don't utilize the page you're on within a 20-minute time span, it times you out of the system, and unfortunately, it does not automatically save your work on that page. It's much easier to prep all of your materials in advance prior to entering it into our system. Also, please see the appendices in the funding announcement too, as we shared screenshots of how each of the project's description subsections were structured. If after reading the funding announcement you still have questions about it or any questions in general, first, check the current list of questions and answers, which is that additional clarification document that's on our active funding announcement webpage on our website. We also have a link to that Q&A webpage on our handy one-pager documents as well. The Q&As, as we call them, are updated on a routine basis, and it's possible someone has already asked your question and the answer is already there. If you don't see a Q&A that corresponds to your question, please email our resource account, which is ra-cd-sssc@pa.gov, and put the title of the funding announcement in the subject line. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam to run through some of our most common frequently asked questions that we get.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. So our first one, and we've covered this a lot, so we'll be brief, is whether or not the competitive Safe Schools grant applicants are required to meet all requirements in level 1 baseline criteria before moving on to other levels. So we've covered this. It's not required. We will be looking at those potentially to prioritize, but you can come in for anything that's under those eligible activities. So the next one is another we've covered as well, is around whether you have to have completed a physical security assessment or behavioral health assessment in order to apply. And so again, not required to do that. However, just a reminder rather that we will be using that potentially to prioritize requests. So not a requirement, but if you have had one, please be sure to note that. Moving right along, do approved private schools or APSs apply under the 23-24 competitive school safety grant solicitation or the targeted school safety for non-public school solicitation? So if you are an APS, you are explicitly included in the list of applicants that are eligible for the competitive school safety grant program. And APSs should only submit an application under the competitive school safety grant program, not under both. So just do the competitive school safety solicitation if you are an approved private school. Are counties considered a municipality under the solicitation and thus are able to apply? The answer to that question is that we do consider a county to be an eligible applicant under this solicitation. Last bit of questions that we've received. So is partial funding a possibility for an award? The School Safety and Security Committee, in its discretion, is able to award in whole or in part a request that's made in a grant application based on the merit of a specific item that is requested. Another question that we've received is what is the general timeline for an award? So once the competitive solicitation closes on February 29th, our review will commence. and recommendations for awards will be taken to the April 2024 meeting of the School Safety and Security Committee. That's towards the end of that month. So if your application is selected for an award, staff will be reaching out to you following that meeting, and we'll begin to go through any remaining programmatic or fiscal concerns with you. And applicants who are not recommended for funding will also be notified at that time. So the last question we get is this grant program going to be funded next year? And so the answer is that we do not have a crystal ball here at PCCD. And the answer is that it kind of depends. And it depends on funding being allocated in the state's budget. And those decisions are made by the General Assembly and then eventually the governor. So those are some of the questions we've gotten. Again, if you have any others that we were not able to address, please feel free to reach out to that resource account email that Kirsten mentioned earlier. We certainly appreciate your time and your participation in today's webinar. We wish you all the best of luck as you prepare your competitive applications. And like we said, if you have any lingering questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.